am hosting this morning, and the first thing I need to do is offer apologies from Peter. When he said yesterday morning at the end of his session that you weren't going to see him, he didn't realize how accurate that was going to be for this morning's session, because he's ill in bed in his hotel room. So he hopes to be here a little bit later, but right now he's not with us, and he extends his apologies to Ken. Before we move to our first speaker this morning, who I will introduce, I have the pleasant task of letting you know what we're going to try and do next year. So the two organizations that are going to do this, Peter mentioned it yesterday, are what we call SIASA, and Steve Penman is the co-director of the center with me. And the acronym stands for Center for Excellence in Accounting and Security Analysis. And you know what CARE is, it's for Accounting Research and Education. And Steve and Peter and I decided in talking about both this conference and the next one that one of the things that CISA is really about, or SIASA is really about, is bringing practice, the best thinking of practice and academia together to try to come up with good solutions for policy and for security analysis or investment analysis. And so the problem that, in fact, one of the reasons I left Columbia to go to Morgan Stanley about a decade ago was I felt that there wasn't enough discussion and actually teaching in the education system and research around forward-looking information. Because that's actually what impacts virtually every business decision and every investment decision. And you're going to see from my friend Ken Posner some very interesting ideas about how he tried to attempt that. So this forecasting discussion we've been having over the last day and a half, or will have over the next sort of 2 days, is part of that. But the next part is really this. So the title that we have for the next session, next year, and what we are hoping people will really think about, start doing research in, and then again we'll try and bring some interesting thought leaders from practice together with some of you or some of us, talking about, and we've put the word in deliberately, accounting for uncertainty and risk, and then for investor management and policy implications. And one of the last things I did at Morgan Stanley, or have been doing, was helping to redesign the management information systems to actually manage the business around delivering risk-adjusted returns on capital. Well, that's an easy word to use. It's remarkably difficult to start actually trying to implement in practice, especially when you think about things like capital. And it's really interesting because it is an accounting issue for sure. It's also obviously a management and an investor issue. But what's really interesting, and you saw this in what Keith was saying yesterday, everything Keith was saying sort of layers into this, this specifically. And what's interesting about it as well is if you think about the current policy issues, one of the big arguments that's going on is between the various bank regulators and other regulators and the FASB and IASB as to how much accounting should be dealing with the size of the capital base and so on. So what I wanted to just do for 2 minutes is sort of pose something to you. This is from a presentation or sort of a thought that I did at a financial decision makers conference in Europe, which was essentially a bunch of CFOs and treasurers. So what I have here is a list of assets with sort of sizes of relative assets on the one side and the components of the funding on the other side. And you'll see that the gray at the bottom is essentially the equity component, and then you have various liability/debt components. And you contrast this to the next, the alternative, which has a lot of cash and then a lot of equity and much less debt and so on. And one of the interesting questions that I posed, which I posed to you, is when you think about the amount of equity capital, you think about equity capital using accounting or any other metric you want to, or any other basis of measurement that you want, what really do you think of as the other side? I always talk, or we always talk about assets minus liability equals equity, or asset equals liability plus equity, or whatever decomposition you want of that. What's really on the other side? How do you think about what that equity amount should be? Is it liquidity that Keith was talking about? And he was very open that probably the thing they missed most was thinking about liquidity and liquidity risk properly. Is it the intangibles that you want to take off? Is it the property, plant, and equipment, as some continental Europeans used to think? Is it the riskiness of the assets? Those are actually non-trivial questions. And when you get to a bank or a financial institution where you start thinking about these fair value questions, it becomes an even more interesting question. So this discussion that's going on around leverage as the source of the whole problem, I have no idea what leverage means. Okay, because it really is contingent on the nature of the underlying assets, their riskiness, how you think about the capital, the timeliness, asset liability matching, and so on. So this is sort of a flavor of what we're hoping, Peter, Stephen, and I, that we can start bringing to the table. So what I did was just write down some ideas, because when you start thinking about accounting for uncertainty and risk in terms of decisions specifically or policy, there's a very rich, actually almost anything we do touches on this. So, capital requirements and leverage I've mentioned. The whole notion of fair value is really dealing with uncertainties. So I think someone mentioned yesterday about these sort of terrible level 3 assets. Actually, I often think level 3 has the potential to be more closer to an intrinsic value, if it's done right, of the asset than a current stock price-based fair value or mark-to-market, given certain circumstances. And we can talk about that at a different time. So again, it's all about how you think about that future and the uncertainty and the risk. In IFRS 7, you actually are required to give disclosures around certain risks, including things like liquidity risk, potentially operating risk, and so on, which go into the Basel capital requirements. Well, we as accountants have a lot to say about that. We just don't do very much right now. And it's actually quite interesting if you look at these disclosures, how poor in many ways they are of representing them, although the Europeans do a whole lot better job than we do here in the US. Loan loss or other reserving is a very big topic right now, how much we should be focusing on the future versus not. So this is all risk and uncertainty. Taxation, the whole area of insurance, which both regulators are dealing with, and clearly it's a big issue given AIG and everything else that's been going on. Credit default swaps are just a form of insurance. Pensions and post-employment benefit and leases as well is another area where the FASB and ISB are about to expose a new exposure draft on all this, so they're changing all that. That's all, especially the pensions and OPEBs, are really about, how to assess uncertainties about various actuarial things. So, you can go on, someone mentioned impairments yesterday, it's another area. So it's a very, very rich set of potential topics that we will try to cover, and you will be hearing more about that. Okay, so that's the introduction. We're going to hold it in the New York area. I can assure you right now the facilities will not be nearly as nice as they are here, unless Laurie can come up with some amazing magic. And but we hope you'll all be there. So this little cartoon is about forecast models. And if you think about what Keith was saying yesterday, he has an amazing organization to try to provide this for him. And there's a lot of research and work done around what analysts do. My own personal view, having been in that world for a long time and on the corporate side as well, is this is probably more representative of reality than any of the numbers that you see. Okay, most of it is a figment of people's imagination. And I've developed a course in fundamental analysis at Columbia since I'm back, and I tell my students, if anyone gives me a projection that's a percentage of revenue for their final project, which is a 2-year forecast, they get 0. And yet that's the way everybody teaches, or most people teach. So that's a sort of a general view. But the reality is when you try to do this in practice or in class, it's remarkably difficult. And our next speaker, Ken Posner, was a colleague of mine at Morgan Stanley who I enjoyed very much working with. because Ken is one of these very cerebral people who actually likes to think about these things and try to get it right. And he chose one of the easiest areas, which is specialty finance. So what does that mean? It means Countrywide, Fannie, Freddie, and a few other trivial companies that, or companies that are very easy to analyze. So he had a very, very difficult job in terms of really trying to think through the risks and uncertainties clearly, but just how to actually analyze and project things for these companies. And Ken left Morgan Stanley, or when he moved from the research side for a while to help with some investment banking where he had been before. He then went and worked in a private equity / hedge fund shop to do some special projects. And now he has created with some others a firm to actually make acquisitions in the financial institution or bank area. And so he's a principal at a place called North American Financial Holdings. He's written this book to try to help all of us think how to maybe make less mistakes than we've made in the past. So with that, I'm going to hand over to Ken. And he's going to take questions as we go. If you can go to the mics, that would be great. If not, he will repeat the question, I hope.